Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of Unscripted and Unchained RPG Review. I am DM Bloodworth, and as you can see by the graphics, today's video is going to be part 4 of my MYFAROG 3.0 series. Today I'm going to focus on the combat system. So let me just switch over to this view here. So once again, here is the core rulebook of MYFAROG. And everything you need for the game is contained in this one volume. And we are going to take a look at the combat system today. So one of the first things you need to know about the combat system is that during character creation, there's talents that a character can select. That in the beginning, they select one talent, and they can, if they wish, take up to 2 flaws for each additional talent for a total of 4 flaws and 2 additional talents, so having 3 talents. Now, talents are broken down as being a primary talent and then, or a prerequisite talent, and then a secondary talent. So if we go on down here and we start looking at some of these talents, you can see some talents like aggressive will give you a +1 initiative. They'll give you an advantage in the attack order. So that's something that might be something that the character, the player, wants to boost up. Going on down, continuing, there's enduring, which is going to give a +2 stamina. The way stamina works in combat is your stamina score, let's say it's a 9, will mean that you will be able to function, perfectly well for 9 consecutive action rounds or combat rounds. After which point you will then start to become fatigued. So this would add 2 additional rounds of not becoming fatigued, which is actually a pretty decent bonus. Here we have fighters, so you have your first true combat-based trait, and fighter will give you a +1 to melee, so that's a +1 chance to hit. And then the modifiers to hit are actually what creates the condition to do more damage. It's not like a strength bonus gives you a bonus to hit the target, not necessarily a bonus to damage the target. That is kind of a secondary way that it works. And I'll explain that when we get there later on. So good reflexes will give you a +1 to initiative, a +1 to dexterity only in determining dodging proficiency, and a +5 melee block when using a shield, +5%. So to have a trait that gives you 3 bonuses or 3 types of bonus in a, for just one talent is actually, pretty valuable. It's something that I would consider. Going on down, being marked gives you a fortitude check. That's not so much. There is one for melee weapons. So thrower will give you a +1 to melee. So in character creation, even after you've chosen your role, and I'm going to get into roles as well, you start looking at traits and see how else can I further enhance my my character's combat ability. So now we're going to turn the page here, and we are going to, I grabbed 2. Oh, it's 2 is on one page. So let's see how we do this. So roles. So you select your character roles, and sometimes they're determined by what your attribute scores are, because roles do have attribute score requirements. But we're going to just take a look, keep on looking at the warrior, which is the base combat class or role. And when we come over here, I mean, you do have some others as well that are kind of combat focused, like rangers. But here you have the warrior. The warrior needs a minimum of a constitution of 9, so equal to or greater. equal to a greater strength of 13, and equal to a greater willpower of 9. And in this case, because they're, you know, warriors must be males. Female characters can be rangers. It is possible for them to be rangers. So there's somewhat of a division of roles for the two different genders, and that's more of a cultural aspect of the setting. You could, of course, disregard that if you're playing MYFAROG in a different setting. And then when we come down here, we take a look at Warrior. And Warrior can jog rather than walk with their guard up. And when they're part of a formation, they can charge. They can attack with very long reaching weapons from the second line of a column or square formation made up of only dwarves and or warriors. And there's different optional rules such as lowered guard, charges, formations, and combat modifications. They get at 5th level morale tests, which I'll go into detail with morale a little bit later. So they get many advantages for being a warrior. We're going to go to the next tab, and let's see. So that's this blue tab, and I think we are looking at, well, we're just looking at experience. So there is growth. So character roles or races, which are also roles in this, they lead to the number of hit points per level. So you don't roll a die to determine the hit points at new levels. They're just gained by a certain and very small amount. So a warrior would get a +2 to his hit points per level. So he might only start with something like let's say 14 hit points at first level, which is a pretty tough warrior to begin with. And then on second level, he might only go up to a 16. So it's not like your Dungeons and Dragons clone, or even Dungeons and Dragons itself, where you're going to get an additional roll of a D8 or a D10 to roll to see how much they're going to increase. They're only going to increase in hit points by a certain small, generally speaking, amount. That's all obviously modified by Constitution bonus. Moving on, we go to, so that was that. Skill tests, including combat, is based on, how well you roll to what you needed to do. So if your result is within 1 to 2 points of what you were supposed to roll, that's considered to be a success. Just meeting your combat skill is is going to do only half damage. So if you have the ability to hit on a 12, if you only roll a 12, that means that you're only going to do half damage with that attack. If you roll a 13, you will then do your regular base damage. A 14, you'll do your regular base damage. A 15, you will get a +1. And so that's basically a +1 to damage. That's basically how the system works. We get into some equipment, and one of the optional rules is Encumbrance. And Encumbrance can affect your fatigue levels. It can affect your strength and your movement. If you are overweighted down with your equipment, you obviously don't have the maneuverability. It's much easier to hit you, and and you're going to burn up that stamina a lot faster as well. So there's actually almost 2 pages of modifications due to encumbrance if you want to really focus on that. And continue on. So here I just, of the skills, I just focused on the ones that have very specific combat, effects on it. So writing is a skill, and so there are whole sections in the rules dealing with mounted combat. And we'll get to that a little bit later. There's also aerial combat, and there's special rules on charging while mounted and such. And so there's a number of, possibilities. So examples of tasks of riding on a difficulty of a 6. So you're going to roll 3d8. You have to match or exceed a 6. You're going to ride on a road or in the air. The test will skill is tested every hour. An 8 is riding fast on the road or in the air. An 8 is riding on a path in a field. A 12 is riding fast on a path or in a field. A 12 is also attacking from the animal. And so anytime that you're attacking, you must make both an attack roll and a riding roll. Controlling an animal and taking damage, you need to exceed a 16, so a 16 or better, in order to control your animal that takes damage. Jumping an obstacle and landing softly has some modifiers to it as well. That's also a 16. And then you get a +2 when you're riding where it is narrow. All right, so if there is a narrow space, it's less difficult to maintain control of your, mount, because there's less space for them to actually move about. Moving on, we go to I think I was going to focus on seamanship here, although I had a feeling, perhaps I just put the tab someplace wrong. Well, here is stamina. And once again, I described stamina a little bit, but there's a stamina skill. And it's an attribute. It's 8 plus what your constitution bonus is. And so the average person is going to have 8 stamina points. And so they'll be able to function without fatigue for at least 8 rounds. And that could also be depleted by taking damage and such as well. So you can become fatigued quite quickly in the game if you're, especially in combat, if things aren't really going your way. Looking through. So now we actually get to the combat section of the game. And so characters have several ratings that are important to keep in mind. They have an offensive value for melee. They have a defensive value for melee. They have an offensive value for missile weapons and a defensive value for missile weapons. And the defenses start with a positive 10 base. So all characters, all creatures have a positive 10, which means that it takes at least a 10 to hit them and an 11 or 12 to just do normal damage to them. Anything above that will then have an increase of the amount of damage that they receive. Your offensive value, so let's say we're dealing with a warrior attacking with a melee weapon, they would get a +1 for any melee skill proficiency that they have. Their encumbrance modifier might add or subtract from that. The conditions, so if they're fatigued, if they're injured, if they're soaking wet, it's going to be harder for them to hit. The weapon modifier, if there's any weapon modifiers that exist. If carrying a shield or one weapon in each hand, all right, so dual wielding or carrying a shield will give them a +1, because it's not assumed that you're just using your shield to block attacks. it's also assumed that you're using that in the melee, whether you're bashing, at the other, at your opponent, and even the combat itself. The way that it's described is that you're not just attacking once with your sword during a round. It's assumed that you're attacking with the sword, you're bashing with the shield, you're throwing an elbow, or throwing a kick down at the ankle. You're doing all kinds of things going on in this combat. So it's not as scripted per se, that you're not just, well, I'm going to swing my sword once, I'm going to block with my shield once. A fight is meant to be a grueling type of an action that's going on, and a lot is going on in that 6 seconds time that is a combat round. So there's quite a bit of a scuffle in combat. So dodging, lowering guard. So the hit and damage resolution, so I brought this up already. If you are less than your difficulty setting, the difficulty to hit, you miss, no damage done. If it's a near miss, that means that it's equal to, so if I needed a 12 to hit and I rolled a 12, I'm going to do half my damage. If I rolled a 13 or 14, I'm going to do my full damage. If I rolled a 15 or 16, that's a +3 or +4. That's a rather good hit. I'm going to do an additional point of damage. Remember that the hit points are not as massive in MYFAROG as they are in D&D. You're not going to have fighters with 100 hit points. You might have, some kind of a, mythical beast with that kind of hit points, or like a gigantic boar might have somewhere in the 90s. But human beings are not going to have anywhere near that. I don't think I've ever played a player character that had above 20 hit points total. And that's still fairly low level warriors. So warriors will eventually get there if they last, 5, level 5, or, certainly level 10. Although I think level 10s are really quite rare for this game. But if you do roll, a 10 or above what you needed, it's called a perfect hit, and your damage is going to be the dice roll resembling what the damage die is for your weapon, plus an additional 10 points of damage, which is, quite honestly, is devastating to virtually anything that you'll face. Anytime that you hit, you're going to roll a 3d6 to see if there's either cut effects or shock effects. Blunt weapons tend to shock, bladed weapons tend to cut, although a bladed weapon can shock as well, but it's just less likely to happen, and so on. And same thing with blunt weapons. Blunt weapons can cause bleeds, but it's less likely to happen. And then there are modifiers to, if your character is bleeding and if your character is shocked, there are various modifiers that come into play. There's health points, which is hit points. And if you're familiar with RPGs, they work the same in virtually every game. Anyway, there's toughness and damage. So if your character has toughness for a natural toughness like dwarves have, or if they're wearing some types of armor that gives them a toughness of a +1 or a +2, the +1, +2 means that is how much damage is going to be deducted from any attack that actually strikes them. All right, and so if they are wearing fur armor that gives them a +1 toughness, and they're hit for 1 point of damage, that's meant to represent that damage actually was absorbed by the armor itself. And they may get bruised, they may get pushed back, but they're not really getting injured from it. The combat round, the way that it works is you check for morale first. Now, I kind of homebrew this a little bit differently with morale. I like to wait until, something goes amiss in the combat before I roll for morale check. I always assume that, these are trained, warriors, or these are adventurers. And so entering combat isn't something that they have to, potentially get shaken before it's even started. So I tend to use morale a little bit later on once the combat actually occurs. And usually if something starts to change the momentum of, which side is, winning or losing. The players will, but if you're playing straight rules, they will roll their morale check. They will then declare their actions. Then they will check for, optional rules if you're using these various optional rules, and I'll go into detail with those a little bit later. They'll check their initiative roll. So an initiative roll is you roll a d6 and you add your dexterity bonuses to it. I'm actually over here. You'll add your dexterity bonuses to it. And then each individual, unless you're doing a mass combat, each individual is going to roll their initiatives independently. If they're in a formation, you can roll for that formation's initiative, but you're going to use the least modified initiative roll as part of that unit. So, a weak link in that unit can really hold back the entire unit, but it also makes it that, if the unit wants to stay together and get the advantages of being in a formation, then they really do have to rely on all of their the members of their formation being in position more so than acting with initiative, and so that's why there's that. That's why there's that one roll for the entire unit in a formation. Which is kind of like a trade-off for the advantage that I really like with MYFAROG's combat system, is that there are positives and negatives to every action that you're taking. And speaking of which, here are the formations. And so once again, warriors and dwarves can form up in formations. They have the most advantages for doing so. Fumbling, so when you miss with either a missile weapon or a melee weapon, missile weapons tend to be a little bit more dangerous when you fumble, because they could end up hitting other targets. You can do the same thing with actually melee weapons as well, but it's more likely that you might hit a different target than you might have been intending when you fumble with missile weapons. Morale, which I spoke about a little bit earlier, that's over here, and we go into morale and the different consequences for morale. So if you roll less than a 0 or less, all right, then you're rolling 3d6 and you're applying modifiers to it. You will panic and flee for 2 to 6 rounds. If you roll anything greater than a 9, there is no confidence. All right, there's no consequence. Sorry, there's no consequence. So basically, you're rolling 3d6. You're adding any of your modifiers, and as long as you roll a 9 or higher, you're not going to be affected by morale anyway. The conditions of morale is that if your character is nervous, you are going to be nervous for with a -1 modifier to all skills for the number of rounds that you rolled that you would be nervous for. Afraid is a -2, fearful is a -3, terrified is a -4. Panic is a +1, but it says cannot fight defensively. Use tactical retreat. So they have a +1, but it's a +1 because they're not fighting at all. They're just backing up and looking to get out of the way quickly. So that's why it says a +1. They have a +1 for the maneuver to, basically get the hell out of there. I actually did a play test with a new player the other day, and he started off with being nervous for the first 3 rounds, and that -1 did play somewhat of a role in the combat. And it doesn't take much for these little modifiers to start stacking up, and it creates kind of a snowball effect of either having some really negative consequences to the battle. And I've watched battles turn, I've actually experienced battles turn, very, very quickly against the player group. And I've seen the exact opposite as well. I've seen some really positive rolls, and then all of a sudden you shatter the morale of your opponents, and it becomes that much easier to, just scatter them or wipe them out. Moving on. So we get to the various armor types. So we start getting into the equipment, portion of the rules. So we have, rules for helmets, rules for shields, rules for, dual wielding or a weapon and a shield combo. Different rules for, different types of shields. So they do have different functions. And same thing with the melee weapons and shields. And then there's a section on, obviously, on missile weapons as well. So different types of shields here. So there is a lot of detail in this game if you choose to utilize all of it. Excuse me. Different types of arrows, different types of missile weapons. So you have bows and crossbows. You have composite bows. Excuse me. You had heavy crossbows and such. So a wide variety of different combat methods and equipment that you could choose. The last option, optional rule number 8, is for throwing axes. And so they have a separate rule for throwing axes, and it's basically a separate rule for missing your target. And there becomes a it's a totally different mechanic, because throwing axes kind of deflect it weird ways and such, and so there's a chance that an axe thrown in the wrong or hitting the wrong target could potentially hit more than one other individual. You get less of that with an arrow or a spear or something. So it has the nature of a throwing axe that really comes into play. But anyway, I'll switch over here now. So as you can see, the combat system in MYFAROG 3.0 is can be very complex if you're using all of the optional rules. It could be somewhat simplistic if you've trimmed most of those out and then you've changed a few rules here and there. I mean, I personally, like I said, I use the morale a little bit different. I put it at a different time in the combat and much more situational than automatic. I also don't do bleeds and shock. With every hit, it has to be a good quality or better hit in order to potentially cause a bleed or a stun, I should say. Same thing goes with knocking down. So knocking down an opponent, whether you're using a shield bash or kicking them with your boot, or just charging at them and trying to bowl through them, it has to be a good or better hit in order to cause a knockdown, unless the person has some kind of flaw that makes it easier for them to knock down. Maybe they have some a very low dexterity, and so it's easier to knock them down. So once again, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing. If you have any questions about MYFAROG 3.0, please leave a comment in the in the comments section. If you want to join a group that's playing, I usually try to get a session going, but there is a MYFAROG gaming group on Facebook that is very active, and there's frequent games going on there. Like I said, I usually try to get a small group going, at least once a week. Sometimes it's hard to schedule those things. If you want to learn the game, I will, play one-on-one and teach you how to play the game. And, I already have adventures and, short scenarios to do that. This image that you actually see on here is the scenario that I had run. So it was the one-player character and then two civilian, warrior types. So the player character was certainly stronger than the others, and two characters with shields, one character with a spear and a secondary weapon, as you can see. And even though that's a giant boar and not a regular boar, I did change it to a regular boar because, to be honest with you, a giant boar would destroy 3 first-level characters in no time. So when I ran this, this test of this particular scenario, it lasted for about 3 rounds, and actually into the 4th round. And only the PC ended up getting the attention of the boar, and the PC was probably one good hit away from actually getting killed. And the boar was finally killed in that early portion of the 4th round. So it took the 3 characters some time to actually do it. If you compared that to 3 first-level fighters in Dungeons and Dragons fighting a wild boar, there would have been very little chance of a first-level character actually getting killed in that scenario. So it became close here. And if there were any bad rolls, it would have been, it would have turned really, really bad really fast. So once again, thanks for joining. I hope you liked the video. Enjoy your weekend coming up. I look forward to seeing you on the gaming screen sometime soon. This Sunday, I will be back online, and I'll be looking to put together some some play tests and some adventures as well on Sunday. I know I have one planned for Sunday afternoon, so hopefully that goes off without an issue. And once again, happy gaming out there. Have a good weekend. Thanks for joining.